Chapter 1: The Baltimore Impact. The sky over Baltimore didn't scream, it hissed. A jagged, obsidian spire, a meteorite that looked more like a rusted industrial needle, slammed into the asphalt of North Avenue. It didn't explode. It just sat there, humming, coated in a fine, iridescent silver powder that looked like ground diamonds. Jax was the first one to the site. He wasn't a hero. He was a bottom feeder looking for something to flip. Check the shine on that bitch, he muttered to his partner, D-Lo. They didn't know the powder was an extraterrestrial pathogen, more lethal than H1N1 or any terrestrial plague. Jax reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The silver dust airborne instantly, swirling into his lungs. Within minutes, the street was a circus. People crowded around, filming on their phones, laughing and shouting. They didn't see the way Jax's eyes turned a milky, bruised purple. They didn't see him start to tremble. When the first police cruiser pulled up, Jax didn't follow orders. He lunged. He wasn't just sick. He was frantic, his nervous system being rewritten by a spaceborne virus they would later call the Mercury Strain. The first drops of blood hit the pavement as Jax tore into the officer's throat. The crowd didn't run at first, they recorded. Chapter 2: The Fog of DC. By the time the news hit Instagram and YouTube, the silver dust had already traveled down I-95. In Washington, D.C., the atmospheric pressure pulled the dust into the metro tunnels. Enter Miller and Vane, two disgraced ex-mercenaries who saw the brewing chaos as an opportunity. As the city's hazmat technicians scrambled to contain the fallen object in Baltimore, Miller and Vane were eyeing a federal credit union near Capitol Hill. The cops are busy playing doctor, Miller spat, checking his sidearm. The whole city's looking north. We going heavy. The heist was a bloodbath, not because of the guards, but because the teller was already turning. Mid-robbery, the woman behind the glass began coughing up a thick, metallic sludge. She didn't die. She smashed her head against the bulletproof glass until it cracked, her movements jagged and inhuman. Outside, the sirens of fire trucks and rescue services screamed, but they weren't coming for the robbery. They were coming for the hundreds of people collapsing on the sidewalk, their skin turning a translucent, sickly gray. Chapter 3: The Hazmat Nightmare. Virginia was supposed to be the fallback point. The state government declared a state of emergency as the Mercury Strain jumped state lines in less than 12 hours. Captain Sarah Reed of the regional hazmat team stood in a decontamination tent in Alexandria, her suit feeling like a coffin. She watched the footage on a tablet. Baltimore was a war zone. People were acting crazy, not just violent, but purposeful, as if the virus was a pilot and they were just the vehicles. We've got 15 more coming in. A technician yelled over the roar of the chemical sprayers. They're aggressive, Cap. The spray isn't doing shit. Suddenly, the tent flap tore open. It wasn't a patient. It was a group of looters led by a man named Rico, a local gang leader who had realized that the decontamination experts had the best masks and drugs. Rico didn't care about the virus. He cared about power. He opened fire on the first responders, the very people trying to find a cure. As the technicians fell, the silver dust on their suits kicked up into the air, swirling around Rico and his crew. They were laughing while they killed, unaware that they were breathing in their own slow, agonizing deaths. Chapter 4: The Digital Feed. The internet didn't just report the end of the world, it cheered for it. On TikTok and Instagram, the Mercury Challenge started as a joke. Idiots filming themselves trying to touch the silver dust, until the videos started ending in screams. In a high-rise in Richmond, a cynical influencer named Kazilla sat in front of his ring light, streaming to 4 million people. Yo, look at this shit, Kazilla laughed, pointing his camera out the window. Below, a fire truck had been flipped by a mob of the infected. The feds are saying stay inside, but look at the hazmat nerds getting bodied. They think they're in a movie. As he spoke, the comments scrolled by at light speed. LMAO, is this real? Where is the military? Suddenly, Kazilla's front door kicked open. It wasn't the police. It was a group of desperate, mean-spirited neighbors led by Sloane, a woman who had spent her life feeling invisible and was now enjoying the lawlessness. She didn't want his food. She wanted his platform. She shot Kazilla mid-sentence, his blood splattering across the lens. The stream stayed live, broadcasting Sloane's face to millions as she began to cough. A dry, metallic sound that signaled the Mercury Strain had already claimed its next host. Chapter 5: North Carolina's Highway of Hell. I-85 through North Carolina became a graveyard of burning steel. The virus was moving faster than the news could track. The long metal thing back in Baltimore had been joined by 3 more impacts across the eastern seaboard. Big Mike, a long-haul trucker with a history of violence and a heart of stone, was barreling toward Charlotte. He'd seen the decontamination experts at a waste station back in Virginia being executed by a gang of crazies. He didn't stop to help. He just pushed his grill through the crowd, crushing bones and metal alike. "Get out the way, you sick freaks." Mike roared, gripping a tire iron. When his engine finally died near Durham, he found himself surrounded. The streets were filled with people in the mid-stages of the infection, veins black, eyes glowing with that extraterrestrial violet hue. He ducked into a local pharmacy, intending to loot the medicine cabinet. Inside, he found a group of hazmat techs trying to protect a cooling crate. They shouted about a potential neutralizing agent, a prototype cure. Mike didn't care about saving the world. He saw something he could sell. He swung the tire iron, cracking the technician's skull, and grabbed the crate. Chapter 6: The Georgia Blackout. Atlanta was the first city to go completely dark. The power grid failed as the infected, now called silvers by the media, began instinctively drawn to high-voltage areas. In the heart of the city, Vance, a disgraced doctor who had lost his license for selling opioids, was hiding in a basement bar with 2 other mean survivors, Rat and Gash. They weren't sick yet, but they were dangerous. They had watched the news coverage on a battery-powered TV until the signals died. The last thing they saw was a frantic reporter in D.C. being torn apart by a hazmat team that had turned while still in their protective gear. "The cure is in the blood," Vance hissed, eyes darting. He had a theory that the virus was a parasite that could be burned out with high doses of specific toxins, but he needed volunteers to test it. Rat and Gash went out into the pitch-black streets of Atlanta, snatching people who were screaming for help and dragging them back to Vance's clinic. It wasn't rescue, it was torture. The cries of the victims blended with the sirens of the few remaining firefighters who were still trying to wash the silver powder off the streets, unaware that the water was only helping the virus seep into the soil. Chapter 7: The Gulf Coast Meat Grinder. The heat in Alabama and Mississippi didn't slow the Mercury Strain, it made it more volatile. The silver powder, when mixed with 90% humidity, turned into a caustic vapor that ate through standard gas masks. In Mobile, a man named Gant, a disgraced former cop with a penchant for brutality, had seized control of a local hardware store. He wasn't looking to help the refugees streaming down from the north. He had turned the storefront into a toll booth. "You want to pass through to the coast? You pay in fuel or you pay in blood," Gant sneered, his shotgun resting on a pile of sandbags. Behind him, his militia of 5 mean-eyed drifters watched the road. A hazmat transport, marked with the federal seal, tried to push through. They were carrying the biological data from the Baltimore impact site, information critical to the cure. Gant didn't care about the science. He ordered his men to fire. The truck veered into a ditch, flipping over. As the decontamination experts crawled out, coughing and bleeding, Gant's men didn't offer a hand. They stripped the technicians of their gear and left them to rot in the sun, oblivious to the fact that the metal spire in the truck's cargo hold was leaking a fresh cloud of the violet death. 8. The Siege of St. Louis. The virus hit Missouri like a physical hammer. By now, Facebook and YouTube were flooded with death streams, unfiltered, live broadcasts of cities falling. The world was in a frenzy. The news anchors were no longer wearing suits. They were in tactical vests, their voices shaking as they reported that the silver spire objects were appearing in every major time zone. In St. Louis, a group of survivors led by a cold-hearted woman named Moxie decided that the Gateway Arch was the only place they could defend. Moxie was a career criminal who viewed the apocalypse as a restructuring. She and her crew had spent the morning robbing a National Guard armory, killing 3 soldiers who were distracted by an infected crowd. "The world is dead, boys," Moxie shouted over the wind. were the new kings. From the top of the arch, they watched the city burn. They saw a fire department ladder truck surrounded by thousands of silvers. The firefighters were using their high-pressure hoses to try and push the crowd back, but the water just turned the silver dust into a slick, glowing mud. One by one, the rescuers were pulled down. Moxie watched through binoculars, laughing as she cracked an expensive bottle of stolen champagne, completely ignoring the silver dust gathering on the window glass right in front of her face. Chapter 9: The Chicago Meat Market. Chicago didn't go quietly. The mean players here were the remnants of the city's most violent syndicates, led by a man they called the Butcher. As the virus turned the Magnificent Mile into a slaughterhouse, the Butcher realized that the cure, a synthetic blue serum developed by a dying lab in Maryland, was the most valuable currency on Earth. He had caught wind that a hazmat team was fleeing west with several crates of the prototype. The Butcher didn't wait for them to arrive, he hunted them. His crew used hijacked snowplows to blockade the I-90. When the hazmat van hit the blockade, the Butcher's men swarmed. They didn't just kill the guards, they made it slow, a warning to anyone else who thought they could hold out. "Where's the blue shit?" The Butcher growled, pressing a knife to the lead scientist's throat. The scientist, eyes streaming with blood, whispered, It's not finished. It needs a human host to stabilize." The Butcher grinned, showing teeth stained by the very tobacco he'd looted. He didn't believe in science, he believed in leverage. He took the crates and executed the scientists, leaving the bodies in the middle of the highway as a feast for the infected. The world was screaming. The internet was a digital tomb, and the Mercury Strain was just getting started. Chapter 10: The Rockies' Red Snow. The Rocky Mountains were supposed to be a natural barrier, but the Mercury Strain didn't care about geography. The long metal things were now falling like rain across the Great Plains, and the wind carried the silver powder into the high altitudes. In a secluded mountain pass in Colorado, a survivalist named Vic, a man who had spent years wishing for the end of the world just so he could be the biggest predator left, was hunting. Vic wasn't hunting deer. He was hunting a group of fleeing families who had survived the chaos in Denver. To him, they were just mouths taking up his air. He sat on a ridge with a high-powered rifle, picking them off one by one as they struggled through the thickening snow. "Look at 'em run," Vic chuckled to his dog, a scarred pit bull, thinking they're safe because they're up high. Suddenly, a military helicopter, trailing smoke and silver vapor, screamed overhead before slamming into the mountainside a mile away. Vic's eyes lit up. A crash meant supplies. He didn't care that the pilot might be infected or that the powder was now mixing with the snow, turning the entire mountainside into a glowing, violet death trap. He began to trek toward the wreck, his boots crunching on red snow, a mixture of frozen blood and extraterrestrial dust. Chapter 11: The Salt Lake Massacre. Utah was a frenzy of religious panic and total systemic collapse. In Salt Lake City, the local police and fire departments had formed a final stand perimeter around the city center, but they were being squeezed from both sides. On one side were the Silvers, the infected whose bodies were now stretching and cracking, their bones elongating into jagged weapons. On the other side were the Cleansers. The Cleansers were a gang of 12 psychopaths led by a woman named Mother Malice. They believed the virus was a gift from the stars meant to cull the weak. They moved through the streets with flamethrowers looted from a construction site, burning anyone who looked healthy. "If you aren't turning, you're burning," Malice screamed, her face painted with silver soot. They cornered a hazmat team that was trying to distribute the last of the breathable oxygen tanks. The technicians pleaded for their lives, explaining that they were the only ones who knew how to synthesize the Baltimore cure. Malice didn't even blink. She ordered her crew to douse them in gasoline. As the rescuers transformed into human torches, the Silvers watched from the shadows, their purple eyes reflecting the flames with a terrifying, alien intelligence. Chapter 12: Las Vegas, the Neon Tomb. Las Vegas was the last place on Earth to turn off the lights. Even as the news on every TV screen showed the fall of New York and the burning of DC, the casinos kept the slots ringing. That was until Jackson, a high-stakes robber who had escaped from a transport van during the initial Baltimore outbreak, arrived in town. Jackson was patient Zero Alpha. He was infected, but he hadn't turned into a mindless beast yet. The Mercury Strain had given him a cold, calculating madness and a terrifying strength. He walked into the Caesar's palace lobby, his skin shimmering with a metallic sheen. House always wins, Jackson rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. Not tonight. He began a systematic slaughter, not for money, but for the sheer thrill of watching the normal world break. He didn't use a gun, he used his bare hands, which were now tipped with blackened, obsidian-like claws. Panic turned the strip into a meat grinder. People trampled each other to reach the exits, only to find that hazmat teams at the doors were actually Jackson's recruited crew of thugs wearing stolen suits. They weren't there to decontaminate. They were there to loot the vaults while the world bled out. The Mercury Strain had found its perfect ambassadors, men who were already monsters before the virus ever arrived. Chapter 13. The California Firewall. The Pacific Ocean was no longer blue. Near the shoreline of Santa Monica, it looked like liquid mercury. The silver dust from the Baltimore impact had finally crossed the continent, carried by the jet stream and the frantic movement of millions. In Los Angeles, the firewall wasn't a digital defense. It was a literal wall of burning palm trees and scorched cars. Sloan, the cold-blooded killer who had murdered the influencer Kayzilla back in Richmond, had made it all the way west. She was driving a stolen armored bank truck, her eyes rimmed with a terrifying violet light. She wasn't just sick, she was evolving. She pulled up to a roadblock manned by the last remnants of the LAPD and a terrified fire crew. "Move the concrete, or I paint the street with you," Sloan hissed through the cracked window. A young officer, his gas mask fogged with sweat, shook his head. "This is a quarantine zone, ma'am. Nobody goes into the valley." Sloan didn't argue. She floored the accelerator, the armored truck slamming into the patrol cars. As the officer scrambled, she jumped out, swinging a heavy chain coated in the silver powder. She moved with a jagged, supernatural speed, cracking skulls and snapping limbs. The rescue workers tried to deploy their decontamination spray, but Sloan just laughed as the chemicals hit her skin. To her, it felt like a cold beer on a hot day. The virus had turned her into something that thrived on the very things meant to kill it. Chapter 14. The Phoenix Lab Raid. The cure stolen in Chicago by the butcher had finally reached a secret underground facility in the Arizona desert. The butcher wasn't looking to save humanity. He was looking to sell the blue serum to the highest bidder, a group of billionaire bunkers in the hills. But he needed a scientist to stabilize it. He dragged a captured hazmat technician named Dr. Eris into the lab. Eris was covered in bruises, his hands shaking. "You don't understand," Eris pleaded. "The serum isn't a vaccine. It's a mutagen. If you don't dose it correctly, it doesn't cure the virus, it accelerates it." "I don't pay you for a science lesson, Doc," the butcher growled, slamming his fist onto the lab table. "Make it work, or I start cutting off fingers." Outside, the facility was under siege. Not by the Silvers, but by a rival gang of mean survivors led by Gant, the crooked cop from Mobile. Gant had tracked the serum across 4 states. He didn't want the cure for himself. He wanted to destroy it. He believed the virus was the great equalizer, and he didn't want the rich to have a way out. He launched a shoulder-fired missile at the lab's ventilation intake, sending a plume of fire and silver dust deep into the underground chambers. Chapter 15. Seattle's Emerald Grave. The Northwest was the last to fall, and it fell the hardest. The long metal things from space had landed in the Puget Sound, turning the water into a toxic, shimmering soup. The news was no longer broadcasting from studios. The few remaining anchors were filming on their iPhones from basements, their faces pale and gaunt. In Seattle, a man named Kane, a high-ranking cartel enforcer who had been hiding out in a safe house, saw the end coming. He gathered the last of his mean crew, 6 men who had more kills than years of life. They decided to take over the Space Needle, thinking the height would protect them from the mercury vapor hugging the ground. As they climbed the stairs, they found the observation deck filled with families and first responders seeking shelter. Kane didn't see people, he saw excess weight. "Out," Kane ordered, leveling a submachine gun at a group of firefighters. "This is our castle now. We have children here. The air is poisoned down there," a firefighter shouted, reaching for his axe. Kane didn't hesitate. He opened fire, the rhythmic thud 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 of the gun echoing off the glass walls. He pushed the bodies over the edge, watching them fall into the silver fog below. He thought he was safe at the top of the world, but as he looked at his own reflection in the glass, he saw it. A tiny silver speck in the corner of his eye. The powder had been on the firefighters' uniforms. The Space Needle wasn't a fortress, it was a high-altitude coffin. Chapter 16, The Mutagenic Bloom. The Mercury Strain had finished its incubation period. Across the ruins of the United States, the silver dust didn't just sit on surfaces anymore, it began to grow. In the humid ruins of New Orleans, the powder sprouted into crystalline, jagged vines that pulsed with a faint violet light. This was no longer just a respiratory illness, it was a terraforming event. Vance, the disgraced doctor in Atlanta, watched through his basement window as the vines strangled a group of National Guard soldiers. He had been experimenting on the locals, and his latest subject, a man he'd snatched named Leo, was changing. Leo wasn't just a silver anymore. His skin had hardened into a reflective, metallic armor, and his fingers had fused into 3-inch blades of obsidian. Beautiful, Vance whispered, his own mind fracturing. He realized the virus was an architect. He grabbed a syringe of the unstable blue serum he'd managed to synthesize from stolen samples. He didn't give it to Leo to save him. He injected it directly into his own jugular. He wanted to be the first king of this new world. Instead of curing him, the serum reacted violently with the extraterrestrial powder in the air. Vance's scream lasted for 3 minutes before his jaw unhinged, his vocal cords replaced by a vibrating metallic hum. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He was a hive mind node. Chapter 17, The Road to Denver. The cure in the hands of the butcher in Arizona had become a nightmare. Realizing the serum was a mutagen, he didn't try to fix it. He embraced it. He began salting the water supplies of refugee camps with the blue sludge. He didn't want a healthy population. He wanted an army of monsters he could control. He led his convoy of armored trucks toward Denver, the last city with a functioning, albeit desperate, government presence. Along the way, he encountered a group of hazmat technicians who had set up a decontamination gateway on I-70. They were exhausted, their suits patched with duct tape, trying to scrub the silver death off of terrified children. "Look at these martyrs," the butcher laughed, leaning out of his truck window. "Hey, heroes, scrub this." He tossed a canister of the concentrated mutagen into the decontamination tank. The water turned a glowing, violent sapphire. When the sprayers hit the refugees, they didn't get clean. They began to twist and scream, their bodies warping into the same metallic horrors Vance had seen in Atlanta. The butcher watched the carnage with a cigar in his mouth, filming the experiment for the few dark web servers still running, his mean crew cheering as the first responders were torn apart by the very people they were trying to save. Chapter 18, The Baltimore Zero Point. The story circled back to where it all began, North Avenue in Baltimore. The original long metal thing, the needle-shaped spire, had grown. It was now 300 feet tall, a pulsing tower of silver and violet that acted as a beacon. Jax, the first man infected, was still there. He should have been dead, but the virus had preserved him as a husk. He sat at the base of the spire, his eyes completely replaced by glowing purple crystals. Surrounding him was a court of the meanest survivors who had embraced the infection early. Looters, killers, and sociopaths who found that the virus responded to their internal rage. They had captured a group of high-ranking hazmat experts and military officers from the nearby Aberdeen Proving Ground. Among them was the lead scientist who had first identified the strain. Jax looked at the scientist, his voice sounding like two knives scraping together. "You tried to kill the gift," Jax rasped. He didn't execute them. He dragged them to the spire and pressed their faces against the vibrating metal. The Mercury Strain didn't just infect them. It uploaded the collective agony of every person who had died across the country into their brains. As the news drones, the last few automated eyes in the sky, buzzed overhead, the world watched in high definition as the last hope for a human-led recovery was literally absorbed into the Silver Tower. The broadcasting stations on Instagram and YouTube flickered, showing one final message across every screen. adapt or dust. Chapter 19. The Migration of the Damned. The geography of the United States had become a map of shadows. From the West Coast to the Gulf, the survivors weren't looking for safety anymore. They were being pulled. A low-frequency hum, vibrating out of the Baltimore Spire, acted like a siren song for the infected and the wicked alike. Gant, the crooked cop from Mobile, led a scorched earth caravan through the ruins of Tennessee. He had decorated his armored truck with the helmets of the hazmat technicians he'd slaughtered. He was coughing now, a heavy, wet sound that rattled like loose change in a tin can. He knew he was dying, but he wanted to see the 0 point before the end. "The news says the Spire is a portal," one of his men muttered, staring at a cracked iPad screen. A pirate broadcast on YouTube showed the Baltimore skyline glowing like a purple sun. "They say if we get there, the virus stops eating you and starts changing you." Gant spat a glob of silver-flecked blood onto the dashboard. "I don't care if it changes me into a god or a corpse, as long as I'm the one holding the gun when it happens." They passed a line of abandoned fire trucks, the skeletons of the crews still slumped over the hoses, their brave attempts to wash away the apocalypse now nothing more than frozen monuments to a lost world. Chapter 20. The Butcher's Gamble. The butcher had reached the outskirts of Maryland. His convoy was a rolling nightmare of stolen military tech and crates of the unstable blue serum. He had refined his plan. He would use the serum as a bargaining chip with whatever intelligence was controlling the Spire. But his crew was thinning. The mean men he had recruited were turning on each other, the Mercury Strain heightening their natural paranoia. When they stopped at a looted rest stop near Frederick, a fight broke out over a tin of peaches. Rat, the scavenger from Atlanta who had joined the convoy, pulled a shiv. "The butcher's gonna trade us all to the Spire." Rat screamed, his eyes a flickering violet. "He's gonna use the serum on himself and leave us to rot." The butcher didn't argue. He pulled his gold-plated .50 caliber pistol and blew Rat's head apart. The blood that sprayed wasn't red. It was a thick, iridescent oil. "Nobody leaves the job," the butcher growled, stepping over the body. He looked toward the horizon, where the Baltimore Spire pierced the clouds. The sky was no longer blue. It was a bruised, metallic charcoal, and the air tasted like pennies and ozone. Chapter 21. The Decontamination Pit. In the heart of Baltimore, the hazmat technicians were no longer the hunters, they were the prey. A small group of surviving first responders, led by a fire captain named Miller, had been forced into a cleaning detail by Jax's cult. They weren't cleaning for hygiene. They were being forced to spray the silver powder onto the unconverted, the thousands of terrified citizens who had been rounded up from the surrounding suburbs. Jax and his inner circle of monsters watched from the ruins of a luxury hotel, laughing as the rescuers were forced to become the vectors of the plague. "Spray him, Captain." Jax's voice boomed over a hijacked PA system. "Give him the gift. If you stop, we throw your crew into the Spire's base." Miller looked at his remaining team. Their suits were shredded, their oxygen tanks nearly empty. They were the very people who had been trained to neutralize harmful substances, now being used to spread them. As Miller squeezed the trigger of the pressurized sprayer, he didn't aim for the crowd. He turned the nozzle on the Spire support structure, hoping the concentrated decontamination foam would do something, anything, to hurt the alien metal. It didn't. The Spire absorbed the chemicals, pulsed once, and sent a shockwave through the street that turned the rescuers' bones to glass. The Mercury Strain had no weaknesses left. Chapter 22. The Convergence of Monsters. The ruins of Baltimore were a jagged graveyard of iron and ego. The butcher arrived from the west, his armored convoy grinding over the pulverized remains of emergency vehicles. Gant rolled in from the south, his lungs now whistling with the sound of grinding metal as the Mercury Strain claimed his chest. Even Sloane, the killer from the West Coast, had made it, her eyes now twin voids of flickering violet light. They didn't meet as allies. They met in the dead zone surrounding the Spire, a 3-mile radius where the silver powder was so thick it fell like heavy snow. The three groups of mean survivors, the looters, the crooked cops, and the cartel killers, faced off in the shadow of the alien needle. "The serum is mine," the butcher roared, holding up a glowing blue canister. I control the evolution. You don't control shit, Gant wheezed, leveling his shotgun. Look at the sky, you fat pig. We aren't the kings. We're the fertilizer. Above them, the sky rippled. The long metal thing began to open like a flower, releasing a massive cloud of powder that stayed suspended in the air, forming a colossal, shimmering face that looked like a distorted version of Jack's, the first case. The virus had finally achieved consciousness, and it was hungry for the worst of humanity. Chapter 23, The Final Robbery. The Spire pulsed, and the sound it emitted stripped the paint from the cars. It wasn't just noise, it was a command. The Silvers, the thousands of mutated citizens and first responders, began to move in a synchronized wave toward the three leaders. In a moment of pure, desperate greed, the Butcher, Gant, and Sloan realized the Spire wasn't just a beacon, it was a vault. The base of the structure had cracked open, revealing a core of pure, solidified Mercury Strain that looked like a mountain of diamonds. To these men and women, even at the end of the world, they saw a score. They stopped fighting each other and began a frantic, suicidal store robbery of the alien Spire. They charged the opening, firing their weapons into the mass of infected. Sloan used her supernatural speed to rip through the Silvers, while the Butcher threw grenades to clear a path. They reached the core, their hands grabbing for the glowing extraterrestrial shards. They thought they were stealing power. They didn't realize they were touching the heart of the infection. The moment their skin hit the core, the blue serum in the Butcher's bag exploded, reacting with the pure silver. Chapter 24, The Failed Cure. The explosion didn't destroy the Spire. Instead, it atomized the cure and the virus together, creating a new, third substance, a neon blue vapor that swept across the city in seconds. This was the moment the news stations, still running on automated loops, broadcasted to the remaining bunkers around the globe. The people watching on Facebook and Instagram saw the meanest people on Earth, the Butcher, Gant, and Sloan, being physically fused together by the reaction. Their bodies melted and reformed into a singular, horrific mass of screaming faces and metallic limbs. The cure didn't save them, because it had been developed from the blood of the first cases in Baltimore. It carried the mean DNA of the looters and killers who were first infected. The virus hadn't been neutralized, it had been perfected. The blue vapor didn't heal the sick. It stripped away their humanity entirely, leaving only the predatory instincts of the people who had survived by being the most brutal. The world wasn't being saved, it was being replaced by a species that knew only violence. Chapter 25, The Silent Earth. By the time the sun rose over the Chesapeake Bay, the broadcasting had stopped. There were no more likes, no more shares, and no more breaking news. The Mercury Strain had covered the planet in a fine, silver blue shroud. The Spire in Baltimore stood as the new capital of a silent world. At its base, the fused entity that used to be the mean leaders sat like a gargoyle, guarding the entrance. The 12 mean people who had played their roles in the fall of man were now part of the landscape, literally. Their cruelty had provided the blueprint for the virus to thrive. The police cars were rusted husks. The fire trucks were overgrown with crystalline vines. The decontamination experts and hazmat teams were gone, their suits now empty shells littering the streets of DC and Virginia. The Earth was a meteorite's trophy. As the silver dust settled on the last functioning camera in the city, the final image it captured was a single, silver-clad hand reaching out to touch the lens before the screen went black. The Mercury challenge was over. The virus had won.